Hello and welcome. Our reading today is taken from the book of Lamentations. If you don't know where the book of Lamentations is, neither did I. It's between the book of Jeremiah and the book of Ezekiel. If you're still not sure where that is, do what I did and look it up in the index. But it's Lamentations chapter 1, beginning at verse 1. How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow she is, who once was great among the nations. She who was a queen among the provinces has now become a slave. Bitterly she weeps at night. Tears were upon her cheeks. Among all her lovers there is none to comfort her. All her friends have betrayed her. They become her enemies. After affliction and harsh labour, Judah has gone into exile. She dwells among the nations. She finds no resting place. All who pursue her have overtaken her in the midst of her distress. The words to Zion mourn, for no one comes to her appointed feasts. All her gateways are desolate. Her priests groan, her maidens grieve, and she is in bitter anguish. Her foes have become her masters. Her enemies are at ease. The Lord has brought her grief because of her many sins. Her children have gone into exile, captive before the foe. This is the word of the Lord. I wonder if you've ever spent time away from home. And I'm not talking just about when you go on holiday or something like that, but maybe a longer time, a time when you've had to go away from home for work or to stay with relatives, or for some other reason you've had to be away from where you live. I don't know how you'd feel about that. Maybe that would be really exciting, you get to experience a new place, or maybe actually being away from home actually feels quite difficult. It does for me. I love being at home. I love being surrounded by my friends and my family, for those things that are really familiar, and it's a place of real safety and security for me. I had to spend a month in Leeds when I was training for ordination, and Susanna will testify, I was not very pleased the day or two before about having to go away for those weeks. I didn't like going away from home, even though I knew I'd probably have a great time, and I did, and I was really welcomed. But actually being away from home was really hard. Actually, I got to come home quite a few times during the month, but even so, it was so hard being away from home. I wonder if you've ever experienced that for yourself and known what it's felt like. There's a word we use when we think about this kind of thing, especially when we see it in the Bible. We might not use it when we have to spend a few months away from home ourselves, but the word is exile. You might think of politicians who are often called they're in exile at the moment. So that might be just because they're not in power, but often there's people who are in exile in a different country because they can't they face danger in the country where they're from. And actually, there's a great example of people all over the world who have had to leave their homes, refugees who have had to leave their homes because of war or conflict or persecution or famine or drought, and they've had to go somewhere else to stay with relatives or family, or they've had to leave their country entirely and find a new place and set up a new life for themselves in neighbouring countries or in countries quite far away, actually. There were literally millions of refugees in our world. And I can't imagine what that feels like, to be away from your home, to have to forced out your home, not because you chose to, but because you had to. And to have tried to find that place of safety and maybe are now living in a refugee camp or in somewhere where it's much less safe or secure. An incredibly traumatic experience for so many people in our world, and it's an experience we see in the Old Testament. And today we're going to think a bit about the idea of exile, because it's a really important part of the Old Testament, and if we don't understand it, we don't see and get to grips with it in the Old Testament, we'll miss out on some things that happen later on, especially in the New Testament as well. So how does the exile come about in the Old Testament? Well, because so far, where we got up to in our sweep of the Old Testament, God's people were in the promised land, weren't they? The people of Israel were in the promised land, and everything was going pretty well. A couple of weeks ago, we heard about the dedication of the temple under Solomon, which was this incredible experience when God was really present in that place and with those people. What went wrong? Well, a bit after Solomon, the kingdom of Israel is split into two. There's infighting, they have basically a bit of a civil war, and it's split into two, and Israel is split quite confusingly into two kingdoms, one called Israel and one called Judah. So Israel's the northern kingdom and Judah's the southern kingdom. Jerusalem's in Judah. And those kingdoms exist for quite some years together, and there's a number of kings. You can read about it in Chronicles and in Kings in the Old Testament. And some of these kings are good, and they follow God, and they're faithful, and some are not. And actually they reject God and follow other gods instead. And amongst all this, there's the prophets, and God is speaking to his people and trying to guide them and shepherd them. But in the end, they turn their back on God. And in the end, that leads them down a road that is not good. Israel is invaded by the kingdom of Assyria. And a few decades later, Judah is invaded by the Babylonians. And the way the Assyrians and the Babylonians worked is they wouldn't just invade and destroy a place. They'd do quite a lot of that as well, but they'd take a good chunk of the population back with them. Usually the people who were really influential and important. Maybe those who were in government, or those who were wealthy, or the priests, or people, the real cultural difference makers in the country, and they'd take them away out of the country. There's a good chunk of the population, not just a handful, but a good chunk of them were taken back to Assyria, back to Babylon, and made to make a life for themselves there. We'll read a bit about that next week, where we read about Daniel and the lion's den, because that's set in Babylon, and Daniel is someone who is taken from Judah into exile. So it's not the whole population, but it's a really good part of the population is taken away from the country, and they're in exile, taken to a foreign country far, far away. And that is an incredibly traumatic experience for God's people, especially for the people individually, but for the whole nation as their communal life. They're in the promised land. God has promised this land to them, and suddenly things have gone dreadfully wrong because they've been taken away from the promised land. It's an incredibly traumatic experience, incredibly hard experience, and that's where we land in the book of Lamentations, in that reading I gave to you a few moments ago. Lamentation, it's 5 chapters, it's not very long. It is incredibly beautiful poetry, but it's incredibly tough reading as well. It's really miserable, it's really hard, there's so much pain and suffering when we read it. Those first few verses were about Jerusalem, the capital, the nation's life of the southern kingdom, destroyed. All the life taken out of it. All the hopes and the dreams that the people had put into their life together in Jerusalem and what God promised them, completely wiped away. And it's so in the book, there's so much trying to wrestle with what on earth is going on. It's really miserable and really tough, and there's a great deal of suffering in it. And so when we read this in Lamentations, what I think is a reminder for us as we read it over 2,000 years later, probably 2,500 years later, is actually in the world around us there is real pain. There is real suffering, there is incredible hardship. We know that in our own lives, and we know it in the world around us. This last year has been incredibly hard for so many of us, and so many in our community have experienced things that are incredibly tough. We think about refugees in the world. That experience is unimaginable for so many of us who have a secure and permanent home. There is real pain and there is real suffering in the world, and Lamentations reminds us of it. Because I guess in the church sometimes we can be a little blasé about it. We're easy to try and paper over the cracks. We try and find comfort and persuade ourselves that things will be all right in the end. We try to explain where God is and try to somehow lessen that experience of pain and suffering because we're trying to wrestle with what on earth is going on. Sometimes we really struggle with this in the church, actually, and we really struggle just to sit in the pain and the hardship. This book reminds us that actually there is space in our faith. There is space with God to ask these raw questions which have no easy answer, probably no answer at all, certainly no answer that we can particularly articulate in church. And we can ask them and we can sit in the pain and we can not get an answer. And that's all right within our faith. That works with God. It's not a question of God. We can do that and we have space to do that. And this book of Lamentations is a perfect example of that. And that's okay. At the end of the book of Lamentations, if we go right to the end of it, you might like to have a look at it yourself. Look at the last few verses. It says right at the end of the book, "You, O Lord, reign forever. Your throne endures for generation to generation. Why do you always forget us? Why do you forsake us for so long? Restore us to yourself, O Lord, that we may return. Renew our days as of old, unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure." And that's the end of the book. There is no answer. There is no the hope that the people put in God, other than say, "God, remember us, please help us." I don't know if you've been reading the Psalms. I've been trying to read them over Lent, as many of you know. And at the end of them, there's often a really tough psalm. But it says, "But I'll put my faith in God and things will be all right." At the end of Lamentations, that isn't there. But I wonder if I'd like to add two things to the end. And it's two dots. Because I wonder at the end, rather than a full stop, we shouldn't have one of those, it's called an ellipsis. It's like the ... Because it's saying this is not the end of the story. It's crying out to God for help in the midst of pain and suffering. And it's really acknowledging the hardship and the trauma that these people have experienced. But this isn't the end of the story. We don't finish it. We don't say, well, we don't understand. We're just going to have to live with that. We wait to see what will happen. Wait to see what God will do. And that's not to say that God will come and sort everything out. The people in exile came back to the land eventually, but things they weren't the same. They rebuilt the temple, they rebuilt the walls around Jerusalem. We can read that in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. But things just weren't the same. They didn't feel like they'd really returned to the promised land. Things were still out of joint, out of step. Things were still tough. Eventually they were invaded by the Romans and they were put under occupation again. Things just weren't right. It's not saying that God will just sort everything out for us, but it's saying that God is still working and God still gives us hope. Because the end of the story is not here. And the end of the story is not in the Old Testament. The end of the story, it comes with Jesus. Because Jesus is someone who comes at the end of that ... And God sends Jesus. Not to paper over the cracks, not to make sure everything has a happy ending, although there is hope and there is goodness at the end. But Jesus first lives with our pain and the hardship that we go through. He takes it on himself. We read in the Gospels, we read about Jesus who sees the pain in the world, the suffering in the world, and doesn't just say, it's all right, you're going to have to live with it. It's okay. He reacts against it. You see, sometimes he gets incredibly angry. Sometimes he weeps tears. Jesus takes on the hardship of the world. He takes on our pain and our suffering and our loss on the cross. And through that, finds there is redemption, there is love, and there is hope. Hope that in the end, the world will be set right. Then in the end, we read in the book of Revelation that God will wipe every tear from our eyes, and death and pain and mourning will be no more. That doesn't come easily. That doesn't come just at the end of the book. There is real hardship, and Jesus takes upon our hardship and knows it and lives with it, and lives with us within it. But there is hope. Hope that God does not forget us. Hope that God has not rejected us, because we know that he sent Jesus. Jesus who takes upon all our infirmities, all our weakness, all our shame, all our hardship and loss, and takes them upon himself. And in the end is raised from death to life.